You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans, and I'm sitting here again with Michael Kofman to talk about the war in Ukraine. Mike, thanks for coming back on the show.
Yeah, always glad to be back.
You know, the big topic du jour, de month, is really the battle for Bahkmut, how it's going, what it reveals about both sides, and whether it's been wise for Ukraine to expend so much blood and treasure and munitions on this particular piece of the war. So could you just start by updating us on what's happening on the battlefield in and around Bahkmut?
Sure, although I will caveat what I'm going to say by adding that the situation around Bahkmut's a bit murky, especially since Ukraine has introduced a media blackout in general near the front line, especially at Bahkmut, and also that I think there's a bit too much focus on the Battle of Bahkmut. There are also other battles taking place, but we should start off with it just because it's being, I think to some extent, it's being seen by folks as a litmus test, and I don't think it should be, because I've consistently held to the position. I don't think Bahkmut is in and of itself all that strategic beyond being the focal point of a contest of wills. So over the past month, what's happened in Bahkmut is that Russian forces had been trying to encircle Bahkmut in the pincer. Ukrainian forces seem to have conducted a counterattack or stabilized that part of the line that was threatening the main supply route.
Where is this geographically?
So geographically, this is just west out of Bahkmut. This is by Khromovo and the main road that leads out of the city. Instead, Wagner, backed by the Russian airborne, has been pushing northwest of Bahkmut. In fact, they're quite past Bahkmut if you look at the relative boundaries of territorial control, and they focus on taking the city. And they've been steadily gaining territory both in the north and east and south of the city.
By the city, you mean sort of the city center itself?
Yes, I mean the actual city, and they've crossed, they seem to have crossed the river as well at this point, the Bahkmut River that runs to the city itself. So what's happening is that rather than trying to completely encircle Ukrainian troops, they've instead focused on pushing beyond Bahkmut to the northwest of the city, but they're also trying to press Ukrainian forces out of the city. Now, I'm going to say a few things that will disappoint folks. First, the situation around Bahkmut isn't stable. Ukraine stabilized the flanks, but they're steadily being pressed out of the city. Second, it's clear that the Russian military and Wagner forces, which I think are all nonetheless under the same operational command, have simply changed tactics. Part of the reason could be that they're concerned about exposing their own flanks by trying to pursue an envelopment. Part of it could be that they don't have the forces to complete an envelopment, or, it could simply be a disagreements between Wagner and the Russian military itself. Maybe the Russian forces or Russian leadership is more than happy to expend Wagner on a battle for Bahkmut itself, an urban fight, rather than, you leverage their resources and commit reinforcements in order to complete an encirclement. But what's happened is that both sides have rotated forces. So the battle looked like it slowed down and paused for a bit, but in practice, I think what was taking place was a bit of rotation. And I think now the Russian military, with Wagner in the lead, is trying to take the city itself, and it's beginning to have a lot of overtones of Severodonetsk. Of course, all analogies are imperfect, but it's starting to look a bit like what happened in Severodonetsk back last summer.
You mentioned Severodonetsk, which I probably pronounced incorrectly, but could you tell us, why it's evocative of that situation?
So Severodonetsk was another battle where Ukrainian forces really held their ground and counterattacked within the city against Russian forces, and Russian military was trying to use the LNR mobilized units as much as they could as dismounted or sort of light infantry. And the battle seemed to be going okay for a while, but the truth is I think most analysts who watched Severodonetsk unfold, they reflected on it as a battle where Ukrainian military stayed too long, maybe a couple weeks too long, and then had to withdraw because Russian forces broke through south of the city at Tashkivka and threatened to create two pockets, one around Severodonetsk-Lysychansk, another one around Zolote. Look, I won't kind of go back through this history in detail, but just to say that there's been a discussion, I don't think it's been a especially helpful discussion, about whether the Battle of Bahkmut is sort of a good decision or a bad decision by Ukraine. My sense of it is that there are two principal military objectives in the Battle of Bahkmut. One, attritioning Russian forces. I've held to the line, so is my colleague Rob Lee, who was in Bahkmut with me, that the rate of attrition was favorable several months ago, but isn't so favorable anymore. And secondarily, that actually most Russian elite forces aren't in Bakhmut at all. They're all fighting on different parts of the front, whether it was Vuhledar, whether it was Crimea, whether it was somewhere else. The second objective was fixing Russian forces and Bakhmut long enough so that Ukraine can conduct its own offensive while having a part of the Russian military stuck there. There are two challenges with that. The first is that Russian forces are actually past Bakhmut, realistically, if you look at the map. And the second, they're not committing to it, I think because they recognize that they don't actually get fixed there. And there's a lot of signs that the Russian military has begun to shift to a defensive posture in preparation for Ukrainian offensive.
Even as they seize the center of the city? How do you square those two statements?
Well, actually, exactly so. The Russian military, if you remember, after October and after the withdrawal from Kherson in November, had switched to a defensive posture while Surovikin was in charge, and he let Wagner grind itself away at Bakhmut. In fact, that's when the Battle of Bahkmut began to draw a lot more attention. So I think they're still committed to taking that city, but I think in general, you're beginning to see the Russian offensive. I'm trying to think of a good word for it. I hate when people consistently call the offensive as having culminated every week, and then you can make those declarations, and eventually you'll be right.
Which just surfaced a claim again in the New York Times, an article in the New York Times that I think at the same time made the claim that the Ukrainians had stabilized the situation, but also admitted that Russian forces were taking the center of the city. It seemed hard to square those two claims as well.
Yeah, it's quite contradictory, and it's not just the center of the city. It's also a lot of surroundings north and west of the city. But be that what it may, I think what happened is that Ukrainian forces had prevented a complete envelopment and having the main supply route be cut off, although Russian forces are still quite close to it. So I don't see the situation as substantially less precarious in Bakhmut. I think also that the Russian military is still prosecuting this offensive, but there are a lot of signs that they're calling up everybody on leave and that they are preparing different parts of the line to defend because they're naturally anticipating a Ukrainian offensive at some point, maybe this month. And also there was a shift, similar in the last couple of weeks, of Russian forces essentially abandoning the Battle of Vuhledar, which I think was the least successful battle where they essentially bled several naval infantry brigades worth of equipment along with other supporting units, and instead to push for Avdiivka. And at a certain point last week, or maybe a bit over a week ago, Avdiivka wasn't looking so great either. That started to look similarly like a partial envelopment of Avdiivka. And there's also quite a bit of fighting taking place around Crimea, between Crimea and Liman, with Russian airborne there. All right, so I think the bottom line is that Ukrainian forces have generally held. The Russian winter offensive has done about as poorly as expected.
As poorly as you expected.
Yeah. The situation at Bakhmut is still unclear. I think a lot of folks have gotten the impression that just because Bakhmut hasn't fallen or Ukrainian forces weren't enveloped there in the last 2 weeks, that this means this is a great battle and things are going well. And I don't see a lot of evidence on that account, nor do I think that the Russian push for Bakhmut has culminated, but it may very well play out badly for the Russian military. And I think there's no need to prejudge that situation.
It seems like the debate about how much Ukraine has committed to Bakhmut is going to go on for a very long time, past the end of this war, certainly. But in the near term, it's really about how much gas Ukraine has left in the tank for its own offensive, and whether Bakhmut was wise or unwise with that in mind. Do you agree that's the real question?
Let me put it this way. I think actually the most interesting question is what happens after Ukraine's offensive. And what's happening in the battles right now is strongly interrelated with that question. So I think that when it comes to the upcoming offensive, Ukraine has forces set aside in these 3 corps that it's trying to build. And each corps is supposed to have 6 maneuver brigades and additional attachments and support units. Those units have not been part of the fighting that's been taking place, but they're also largely fresh and mobilized, to my best knowledge, right? That's sort of the upshot and also the downside. The ammunition that Ukraine has been expending in this fighting, whether you think it's strategically sound or not sound or just politically symbolic and what have you, I think what's going to happen is Ukraine, as it's been reported, is likely going to get a substantial injection of artillery ammunition in support of this offensive operation. Okay? So at best, one can guess that Ukraine has a bit of runway for a series of offensives over the course of the spring, maybe into the summer, depending on when they choose to launch this offensive. All right. The question, though, is what happens after that? Because a lot of the indicators suggest that in terms of material assistance from the West, that this may be the high watermark for support. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do think that there's going to be a challenge, particularly in certain categories, and I tend to very much focus on artillery ammunition and those kind of things, that there will be a challenge to provide Ukraine with a sufficient relative advantage over the Russian military after this offensive period. And I want to qualify that. It's one thing to provide Ukraine the amount of ammunition that they need, let's say something like 90,000 artillery shells per month to sustain the war and to sustain defensive operations and to fight the Russian military or defend against offensives. It's another to be able to provide the kind of equipment and the amount of ammunition required to attain a decisive advantage over Russian forces.
On the offensive.
On the offensive. And however this offensive goes, Ukraine is going to lose personnel, it's going to lose equipment, and it's going to spend a lot of ammunition on it, right? No matter how it plays out. So here's where the Battle of Bahkmut and some of these other battles come in. Because after this, there's a good chance that Ukraine may be living paycheck to paycheck in terms of what it gets in military assistance from the United States and from Western countries in key categories. I don't know that's going to be the case, but it very well could be. Second, there are two pools from which the Ukrainian military has to draw from. The first is artillery ammunition. So whatever artillery ammunition it spends now, when this offensive is over and when Ukraine has burned through the artillery ammunition that they've been given, okay, then that will directly affect how much they have left to sustain operations. The second is pool of manpower and quality of manpower, which, as we've been discussing, especially since we got back from Ukraine, has been an issue, and training has been the long pole sort of in the tent in terms of military support for Ukraine, I think, going back to the summer. So the Ukrainian military has to mobilize personnel to fill these new corps and to also replace losses, okay? After the offensive, it'll have to keep mobilizing personnel again to replace losses. The issue will come down to how much Ukraine has sort of spent from these two pools, manpower availability and artillery ammunition. The reason I raise this topic of conversation is that I have no idea what will happen in the offensive. But if you look at what happened after the Kharkiv and Kherson offensive, a lot of people were optimistic, I would say including myself, that as the Russian military was quite vulnerable, the Ukrainian military could then continue pressing them into the winter. But they couldn't, because they themselves were also suffering from exhaustion, from a lot of losses, and they had to focus on force reconstitution.
And they had focused so much on Bahkmut. That became the main focus for both sides in terms of manpower expenditure and ammunitions expenditure.
That's right. And the other battle that the Ukrainian military tried to press, Bahkmut was a battle imposed on Ukraine by Russian military. The Ukrainian military was trying to drive from Liman to Crimea and got to the outskirts of Crimea and then essentially ran out of gas. All right. So the situation as I see it, the challenge can be after this offensive, the Ukrainian military then doesn't have enough left in the tank, so to speak, to sustain the momentum, and then has to go into another operational pause that becomes a period of indeterminate fighting. And then after that period comes the question of whether or not Western countries have the will and the capacity to provide Ukraine a sufficient military advantage again. And I raise this question not as like a statement in disguise. I genuinely don't know. But I do understand that we are operating with a lot of material constraints. And a lot of the investments have been made in things like artillery ammunition production have either been made very late or are only being made now. And are being made with a lot of fanfare, and publicity without the express point that I think needs to be stated that all of these things should have been done last year and quite a long time ago in order to be relevant in what could be the decisive period of the war, which is the coming months.
I'd like to have a brief conceptual diversion, which relates not just to Bahkmut, but the war writ large and most wars. Could you talk a bit about the relationship between time, space, and manpower in these kinds of choices, whether they're operational or strategic choices in war. If you think about, well, if we don't hold the line at Bahkmut, we just have to hold the line somewhere else and somewhere else. But Ukraine's a big country, so it can afford to make these trade-offs to preserve the force and to preserve manpower and munitions. And it can gain time by trading space. So just reflect on that.
Sure. So, Ukraine had pursued a defense in-depth strategy early on in the war for lack of alternatives. On some areas, it pursued a pretty effective mobile defense as well and how they used their units, particularly in the eastern part and northern part of the country, and had concentrated on using key defensive points, terrain, and cities in order to maximize their advantage on the defense against Russian forces. So the second challenge was that Ukraine had a structural advantage in manpower for much of last year, I would say. Certainly, maybe if you don't include the very, very beginning of the war, the first couple of weeks, and then following Russian mobilization late into the fall. And it used that manpower advantage fairly decisively because the Russian military's only ability to advance was by concentrating firepower and leveraging the fire's advantage that the Russian force could bring to bear. And eventually that strategy was going to result in diminishing returns. But there was a real intersection at the end of it where when in key areas or sort of cities where Ukrainian forces chose to make a stand, like Severeign was one of them during the summer, I think that was probably the toughest point for the Ukrainian armed forces, with the exception of the initial invasion, right? If you look back on it, that is when the level of attrition was very high, and Ukrainian military chose to obviously stop giving up terrain, but to actually turn about and fight for cities like Severodonetsk. And they inflicted a lot of loss on the Russian forces, but the same was true of themselves as well. And they were running low on ammunition and increasingly dependent on territorial defense units to hold flanks and parts of the line. So I think probably the second most difficult point for the Ukrainian military was back then over the summer. So if I reflect on kind of manpower and time and space, what I basically see is that as an analyst, we are naturally drawn towards space as how we assess progress in the war, because we can see territorial control and lines change, and we see that as being proximate for success or failure.
And determinative of the outcome.
Right, but that's actually not the case at all. And as you saw what happened in Kharkiv and Kherson, the Russian military worked very hard to take the territory they could between April and August, okay? But over the course of that period, they'd bled a lot of manpower. They had left themselves with a significant strategic deficit and vulnerability across the board. And the Ukrainian offensives, particularly Kharkiv, were able to retake thousands of square kilometers in a very short amount of time because of it. Because the things you can't see if you focus on territory is what's happening to the force. Are they out of manpower? Are they out of ammunition? Is their morale low? Are they poorly supplied? Are those lines not even manned by Russian forces? Are they manned by riot police and, mobilized LNR units? So that's the big challenge of focusing on fights like Bahkmut, is that there's a lot you can't see and you don't really appreciate necessarily what's happening with ammunition, manpower. I think the Russian military is using up too much artillery ammunition that they're going to miss in the spring. I think in terms of manpower, they could probably replace it over time, especially Wagner troops. I think Ukrainian armed forces, I won't judge or assess their strategy because I don't like armchair generalship, but I think that they'd shifted, particularly at the political level, from a strategy of sort of defense in depth to a strategy of defend everything and hold everything. And that became clear over the course of summer and especially after the fall because the expectations changed, right? Their expectations very quickly went from expectations of survival to victory, and from doing what they had to do to survive the initial Russian invasion to focusing, to not giving up any more territory, especially under the belief that any territory they give up, they're just going to have to fight for it to regain, right? So I don't know what else to add on that score, but I think that this war teaches valuable lessons about force reconstitution, about what happens to armies over the course of a war like this, where you lose a lot of your best people and you lose a lot of your initial army. That's why I say that neither the Russian or the Ukrainian military a year later looks the way they did when the war began. And you wouldn't recognize these militaries if you looked at them today. They've gone through personnel and structural changes and changes also in how they fight, certainly on both sides. The other thing I would say is that when you're trying to assess the prospects for either military, you have to be frank about the uncertainty. There's a lot we can't see. How short is the Russian military really on artillery ammunition? How much artillery ammunition is the Ukrainian armed forces going to get? What is the state and level of training? How do you assess morale? Are they intangibles? I often kind of joke, the problem with intangibles is you can't measure them, because if you can measure them, we wouldn't call them intangibles. We could count them like tanks, right? This is a big challenge as well.
So I have some questions I'd like to get into on the manpower situation on the Russian side, in the formal Russian armed forces. But before I do, you mentioned earlier the LNR and DNR forces. And of course, those are the forces of pseudo-states that Russia set up after 2014, the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. We haven't heard a lot about the LNR forces and DNR forces in their role that they've been playing in this current Russian offensive that's in the process of petering out. Where have they been fighting? And have they taken a back seat? Have they sort of been spent as effective military forces to the extent they ever were effective military forces?
I think they've mostly been spent. They're still fighting in the same places they were fighting early on in the war. LNR units typically fight for parts of Luhansk and DNR for parts of Donetsk. I think that they were used heavily to offset Russian casualties and the lack of infantry in Russian forces between April and June of last year. They went through several waves of mobilization, and it got to a point where there's nobody left to mobilize. A lot of the complaints you see on the internet from mobilized Russian personnel in territorial troops, which are formed into regiments, are probably from the Avdiivka front in Donetsk, because they're technically assigned or seconded to DNR's 1st Army Corps. And what's happening is I think they're being taken one battalion at a time and rotated into the fight in Avdiivka and thrown into infantry assaults. And the reason for that is probably a lot of what was available in the strength of DNR has already been spent in this war. If you look at the casualties across the Russian military, DNR and some of I think Luhansk as well had published casualty rolls during different parts of last year, and you could see that they were quite significant. So what's happened, I think, is that what's left of those forces are still participating in the fight, but inherently reliant on Russian troops and on mobilized Russian forces in particular on those fronts like Avdiivka, maybe Marinka.
So what is the manpower situation on the Russian side in the formal armed forces now that this offensive is petering out?
This is a really good question, by the way. I think what's happening now...
Thank you. I have lots of good questions.
Okay. We'll see.
It's kind of my thing.
I think the big question is, how much will the Russian military have exhausted and depleted itself ahead of the Ukrainian offensive, right? Because the best thing the Russian forces could have done for Ukraine is actually launch this ill-timed and ill-conceived winter offensive, exhausted themselves to an extent, then leave themselves open to Ukrainian counterattack. The challenge with that is that while the Russian military certainly spent some brigades and some units on this operation, right, they have a very substantial number of motor rifle troops and territorial troops as reserves, and they're echeloned holding these lines. So the lines are a lot denser, they're multiple echelons, and they're entrenched. On the manpower front, I think on the Russian side, obviously all is not well. What they are attempting to do is they are trying to recruit, again, hundreds of thousands of people into the Russian military as contract servicemen. They're trying to avoid another mobilization. And they promised there wouldn't be another mobilization technically, although I don't think that promise is going to work out for them. The reason why is they essentially attempted to do this last spring and summer, and it didn't work very well. What they have done is they seem to have issued a quota to every region, and they've also gotten state enterprises to start building out their own kind of units as well. And they've been collecting, essentially updating information on everybody that's listed, that's sort of listed of service age or technically listed under the reserve, and then calling these people in and then pressuring them to sign contracts. And they're offering quite a bit of money, and I think they're in effect going to try to coerce people to sign up. I think the publicly available quota that they're looking for altogether is something like 400,000 men, which is quite a bit. How much of that they can get, I don't know. And I don't know whether that's the figure starting now or if they're counting some percentage of that figure against prior recruitment efforts. Because behind the scenes, they've been trying to recruit people ever since mobilization began. It's never stopped. But I think the main problem is that the Russian society, while maybe parts support the war, parts acquiesce to the war, in general doesn't seem to want to participate in the war. I think that's the challenge that the Russian armed forces are going to come up against. They probably will not be able to sustain this war without a second wave of mobilization sometime later this year. It's clearly not going to happen now. In fact, they're doing the biannual conscript rotation at this point, which begins on April 1st. And I think when they're done processing that conscript rotation, they're going to relook the question of mobilization based on the numbers that they are getting, right? But as always, they're going to have issues of replenishing losses. They always have cases of what are called 500s, which are people who don't want to fight or who desert or end up missing in action, what have you. And I think in general, the Russian military is back to a point this spring where once again they're stuck. They need more men. They need to not only replace losses, which they might be able to do, but they need to be able to generate additional strength. They absorbed the 300,000 plus mobilization wave largely to rebuild the force that they had lost last year, and also to make up for the fact that they never conducted mobilization to fill the big gaps in their military to begin with. Okay, they built out some reserves, but they had no additional capacity. That's why when back in the winter, in January, people kept talking about a large additional Russian force that was going to show up and conduct a spring offensive. I kept saying, what other force are you seeing out there? There's no other force. Like the entire wave of mobilized personnel has been absorbed, deployed, and the rest are available reserves as territorial troops, but there isn't some other additional army with 300,000 people in it.
Can you go more into why Putin hasn't gone bigger on mobilization?
I think it's domestic politics, internal stability, and economic disruption. I think that first and foremost, probably the challenge is political, though my own view is that the first wave of mobilization wasn't nearly as disruptive as people had expected. Yes, many people left Russia, although many of them, quite a few of them probably left Russia to sit out the mobilization wave and or maybe even...
Well, and a lot of were stopped from leaving as
yeah.
well.
But I think one challenge is economic disruption, certainly. They've been talking about it quite a bit in Moscow. The fact that, look, Russia is not a country that has elasticity in terms of manpower availability and technical skills and labor, right? So having all these men serve in the military, mobilizing additional men, and then having several 100,000 men leave the country isn't good for economic sustainability, right? And one of the biggest challenges, one of the big questions that people have is, to what extent is the Russian state going to be able to sustain this war from an economic standpoint rather than from a manpower or from the standpoint of manpower or generating additional equipment or munitions?
If you want more Mike, become a member at warontherocks.com/membership, and you can listen to his show, The Russia Contingency. I know there's a lot of interesting episodes coming up, and if you feel like we left something out of this episode, it's probably going to end up in the next episode of The Russia Contingency. So thanks for listening. Stay safe and stay healthy.